Is that some kind of joke? The voice was sharp, cutting through the humid air of the military base. Corporal Jason Matthews stood tall, his hands on his hips, looking down at the frail old man in front of him. Jack Miller, at 87 years old, wasn't much to look at. His coat, faded and weathered by time, hung loosely around his thin frame. His eyes, however, were sharp, filled with a quiet intensity that didn't match his age. The young corporal sneered as he scanned the old man up and down. "What's a guy like you doing here? You're not supposed to be on this base." Jack's calm gaze didn't waver. He had seen much worse than the mockery of a young, arrogant soldier. He had faced battles that had tested his limits. Yet here he was, standing still, his expression unreadable. "I'm here to see Vice Admiral Thomas Richards," Jack replied quietly, his voice steady and devoid of emotion. Matthews chuckled, his laugh loud and dismissive. "Vice Admiral Richards? Yeah, sure. And I'm the King of England. You're just some old man playing dress-up. Get out of here before I make you." Jack didn't flinch. He didn't need to explain himself. But Matthews wasn't about to let it go. "I need to see your ID. You're not just gonna walk in here like you own the place," he continued, pulling out his clipboard and waving it in front of Jack's face. Jack reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small, faded card, but Matthews wasn't interested. "What's that supposed to be? Some kind of joke?" he mocked, flicking the card with his finger. Jack didn't react. Instead, he allowed his mind to drift back to another time, another place, where this kind of disrespect was a daily occurrence. The battlefield in Vietnam had no room for mockery. He remembered the chaos, the heat, the sound of gunfire all around him. He remembered saving the lives of men much younger than him, men who didn't question his worth. But here, on this base, it was different. Matthews wasn't done. "You're a civilian. You don't belong here. Now, if you don't leave, I'll have to call security." Just as he said that, a second officer walked over, sensing something wasn't right. Lieutenant Sarah Hayes, a sharp-eyed officer who had been watching from the distance, stepped forward. She paused for a moment, observing the tension in the air. Something about the old man struck her as familiar, though she couldn't quite place it. "What's going on here, Corporal?" she asked, her voice firm but calm. Matthews looked over at her, his frustration evident. "This guy's pretending to be someone he's not. Claims he's here to see Vice Admiral Richards, but I don't believe it. He doesn't look like any kind of officer I've ever seen." Hayes turned her gaze to Jack. His posture, though aging, still exuded the confidence of someone who had seen and survived things that most people couldn't even imagine. "Wait here," she said, before walking off to make a quick call. Matthews crossed his arms and muttered under his breath, "Yeah, right. I'll believe it when I see it." Minutes passed before Lieutenant Hayes returned, her face now serious. "Jack Miller?" she asked. Jack nodded. "That's me." Hayes looked over at Matthews, her expression unreadable. "Corporal, you might want to rethink your assumptions. This man is a legendary SEL, and Vice Admiral Richards will be here shortly." Matthews blinked, stunned, as the gravity of the situation began to sink in. Jack Miller? The same Jack Miller who had saved countless lives in some of the most dangerous missions of his time? Before Matthews could react, a figure appeared at the entrance of the base, walking with authority. Vice Admiral Richards. The entire atmosphere in the room shifted. The young corporal went rigid as the Vice Admiral approached Jack, his face softening in recognition. "Jack, it's been too long," Richards said, his voice filled with respect and admiration. He extended his hand, and Jack took it with the same calm demeanor he had carried his whole life. "You're a legend around here, Jack," Richards continued, nodding towards Matthews and the rest of the officers. "I've known this man for decades. He saved my life, and countless others, in the toughest of conditions. Show some respect." The room fell silent. Matthews stood there, stunned, as the realization hit him like a wave. This wasn't just any old man. This was a SEAL, a man whose story would never be told in the halls of a military base, but whose actions had shaped the very foundation of the armed forces. And now, as the Vice Admiral saluted him, the room understood. The man they had dismissed was a hero, an unspoken legend. And as the Vice Admiral turned to leave, he gestured for Jack to follow, the doors to the military base swinging open for a man who had earned his place long ago. The base was quieter now, but the air still buzzed with tension. Jack Miller stood still, his eyes steady on Vice Admiral Richards, who had led him through the gates with a silent, respectful nod. Matthews, still in disbelief, had been left standing in the wake of a moment he couldn't comprehend. It wasn't just about the old man anymore. It was about the weight of the respect he commanded, a respect that had been earned not through rank or title, but through something deeper, something that cut through the arrogance of youth and found its roots in a lifetime of service. As they walked, Jack felt the familiar weight of his past settle around him like an old coat. The years had not dulled his memories, nor had they softened the lessons of his time in uniform. He had been there, through the darkest days, through the fires that tested men's souls. His hands, though weathered, still held the echoes of those moments, moments that were known only to a few. As they approached Richard's office, the Vice Admiral spoke in a low voice, one that only Jack could hear. "You know, Jack, I always knew you were a man of few words, but I never thought it would take me so long to truly understand what that meant." Jack glanced up, his face unreadable. "Some stories don't need words, sir," he replied softly, the weight of his own experiences resting in his voice. Richard smiled, a brief flash of understanding crossing his face. They reached the door, and Richards paused, turning to Jack. "It's time for them to know, Jack. Time for them to understand who you really are." Jack nodded, not a word spoken. They entered the office, and for a moment, the room was still. The officers inside, all younger men in polished uniforms, stood up in unison as Richards motioned for them to sit. The Vice Admiral cleared his throat before addressing the room. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice commanding, "this is Jack Miller. He is one of the most decorated SEALs in history. The man who saved countless lives during operations you've only read about in textbooks. And he has been, right here among us, all this time, unnoticed." The room fell silent. The young officers, who had once looked at Jack with disdain, now stared in shock. The weight of Richard's words hung heavy in the air. One of the officers, his face flush with embarrassment, looked over at Jack. I didn't know," he said, his voice small, almost ashamed. Jack met his gaze, but he said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was more powerful than any words. Richard stepped forward, placing a hand on Jack's shoulder. "You may not understand now," he said, addressing the room, "but you will. Jack Miller has done more for this country than most of you will ever know. And it's about time we recognized him for what he truly is, one of the finest warriors this nation has ever produced." The officers stood once again, this time not out of formality, but out of genuine respect. Jack could feel their eyes on him, and though his outward expression remained calm, he knew the impact of this moment would resonate with them forever. He had never sought recognition, nor had he needed it. But now, standing in the presence of those who had once dismissed him, he realized that sometimes, respect is something that must be earned through actions, not words. And today he had earned it. As the room slowly filled with murmurs of respect and acknowledgement, Jack felt a strange peace settle over him. The weight of the past, the sacrifices, the struggles, had all led to this moment. It wasn't about the tattoos, the medals, or the titles. It was about the life he had lived, the battles he had fought, and the quiet dignity he had carried with him all these years. Jack Miller, once an unknown figure to many, was now a man whose name would never again be questioned. The quiet hum of the bass lingered in the air as Jack Miller sat in the small conference room, surrounded by officers who had, just hours ago, dismissed him as nothing more than an old man. Now, they were all looking at him with a newfound respect, though none of them dared to speak just yet. Vice Admiral Richards had left the room for a moment, and the officers remained silent, absorbing the weight of what had just been revealed. Jack's presence had shifted the room's energy, leaving everyone uneasy with the realization that their earlier treatment of him had been completely wrong. The room was heavy with unspoken apologies, though none of them would dare voice them. Jack, however, remained calm. He didn't need their words. His life had never been about seeking acknowledgement. It had been about duty and honor, and those things did not require recognition from others. As he sat there, the memories of his past drifted into his mind, bringing with them the familiar comfort of the quiet moments that had defined his service. The sound of the helicopter blades slicing through the humid air, the smell of burning fuel mixed with the earth beneath his boots, and the feeling of a mission accomplished, no matter the cost. Those were the things that stayed with him, The things that no one in this room could ever truly understand. I've seen more than you can imagine. Jack finally spoke, his voice low but steady. The officers turned toward him, waiting for him to continue. You all think you know what it means to serve, but you haven't walked the roads I've walked. You haven't been where I've been. And I don't expect you to. But what I expect, what I've always expected, is respect. He paused, letting the words sink in. I've earned it the hard way. Not by titles, not by medals, but by being there when it mattered. A young officer, Lieutenant Carter, looked at Jack with a mix of curiosity and hesitation. Sir, if you don't mind me asking, what was it like to be in those moments when it all mattered? Jack turned his gaze toward the young officer, his eyes softening just a fraction. It was never about the moment. It was about the people, the ones who needed you, the ones who depended on you. You don't think about the danger or the sacrifice. You just do what needs to be done. The room fell silent again. The weight of Jack's words settled over them, and for the first time, they saw him not as the frail, quiet old man who had walked into their base that morning, but as the man he truly was, a living legend, a hero whose actions had saved lives, whose sacrifices had built the foundation of what they now called duty. So, what now, sir? Another officer, Lieutenant Johnson, asked hesitantly. Do you plan on staying here with us? Jack's lips curled into a slight smile. I've served my time. I've done my part. You're the future now. It's up to you to carry the weight. His voice was firm, yet there was a warmth in it that hadn't been there before. It was as if he had finally let go of the heavy burden he'd carried for so long, trusting that those who came after him would carry it forward. The officers nodded, understanding that this wasn't just about Jack Miller. It was about all the unsung heroes who had come before them, whose names would never be known to the public, whose sacrifices would be lost in the shadows of history. But in this room, in this moment, they would never forget. Jack stood slowly, his movements deliberate but unhurried. He didn't need to say anything more. His presence had already done the talking. As he walked toward the door, he paused, looking over his shoulder. Take care of each other, he said quietly. That's the only thing that matters in the end. With that, he walked out, leaving the officers to reflect on the legacy of a man who had taught them more in a few minutes than they had learned in years. They may not have known him before today, but they would never forget him now. The day was slowly fading into evening as Jack Miller walked away from the base. The officers he had left behind were still reeling from the revelations, their minds processing the weight of what had just occurred. They had seen him as nothing more than a relic, an old man who had outlived his usefulness. Now, they understood how wrong they had been. Jack didn't look back as he made his way through the familiar streets near the base. He had no desire for recognition, no need for applause. He had always lived his life for the moments when no one was watching, when the only thing that mattered was doing what needed to be done. His footsteps echoed in the empty street, the quiet rhythm of his walk a reminder of the years that had passed. He was no longer the young man who had once charged into battle, full of fire and adrenaline. Time had softened him, but it had also given him something far more valuable, perspective. He had seen so much, lost so much, but in the end, it had all led him to this moment, to this peaceful walk. The weight of the past no longer felt as heavy as it once had. He had given everything he could give, and now it was time to let go. As he walked past the small diner he used to visit during his younger days, Jack paused for a moment. The place had changed little over the years. It was still the same warm, comforting haven it had always been, where the world outside seemed to fade away, and all that mattered was the next cup of coffee. He stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming softly. The waitress, an older woman with a kind smile, looked up and greeted him warmly. Well, if it isn't Jack Miller, she said, wiping her hands on her apron. It's been a while. Coffee. Jack nodded, taking a seat at his usual spot by the window. He looked out at the world passing by, his mind quiet. The waitress brought over his coffee, setting it in front of him with a smile. I hear you've been making quite an impression lately, she said, her tone light, but curious. Jack looked up at her, his eyes soft. Just doing my part, he replied simply. She studied him for a moment before speaking again, her voice gentle. You know, Jack, I've seen a lot of people come and go over the years. But there's something about you. Something that makes people pay attention, whether you want them to or not. Jack didn't respond right away. He took a sip of his coffee, savoring the warmth and familiarity. "I don't need people to pay attention," he said finally, his voice steady. "I never did. But sometimes, when the time comes, it's nice to know that the ones who matter understand." The waitress smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. She didn't press him further. There was no need to. The people who mattered, the ones who truly understood, had already seen Jack for who he was. The rest? They would learn in time. Jack finished his coffee and stood up, leaving a tip on the table. As he walked back to the door, the waitress called out to him, "Take care, Jack. You've earned it." Jack gave her a small nod, his lips curling into a faint smile. "I'm just getting started," he said quietly, stepping back into the world outside. The sun had set, and the streets were now bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. Jack Miller walked on, the weight of his past no longer a burden, but a quiet reminder of the man he had become. And as he disappeared into the night, it was clear that while his name might never be known to the world at large, it would always hold meaning for those who truly understood what it meant to serve. Jack Miller sat in the quiet of his small apartment, the soft hum of the city outside barely making its way through the closed windows. It had been a few days since he left the base, and the events that had unfolded there were still fresh in his mind. The officers, the respect, the recognition, it had all been overwhelming, yet oddly satisfying. He had never sought that kind of attention, but somehow, it had found him. As he sat there, a small cup of coffee in his hand, Jack thought about the path that had brought him here. His mind wandered back to the early days, when he had first enlisted, eager to prove himself. Back then, the world was simpler. He was just another young man with a mission, driven by a sense of duty that ran deep within him. Those days felt like another lifetime now. He had seen and done things that most people could never fathom, and in the process, he had become someone different, someone hardened by experience, shaped by the trials of battle and the sacrifices of war. But despite everything he had endured, despite all the recognition he had earned, Jack knew that none of it had ever been about the medals or the glory. It had always been about the mission, about the men and women he had served alongside, the ones who had counted on him, and the ones he had never let down. Those were the moments that defined him, not the titles or the accolades. He took a sip of his coffee, the warmth spreading through him, and glanced out the window. The city lights flickered in the distance, a sea of glowing points that seemed to stretch endlessly before him. He had lived through so much, but now there was peace. It wasn't the kind of peace he had found in the quiet of a battlefield, but the kind that came with time, with age, and with the realization that he had done his part. The world had moved on, and so had he. The phone on the table beside him rang, pulling him from his thoughts. He picked it up, seeing the name of an old friend flashing on the screen. It had been years since he had spoken to Colonel Richards, but hearing his voice brought a familiar sense of comfort. "Jack, my old friend." Richards' voice came through, warm and full of the kind of respect that only came from years of shared experience. "It's good to hear from you. I just wanted to check in. You doing all right?" Jack smiled, leaning back in his chair. "I'm doing fine, Tom. Just keeping to myself. You know how it is." There was a pause on the other end, as if Richards was weighing his next words. "I know you've been through a lot, Jack," he said, his voice quieter now. "But you should know, we're all still here for you. You don't have to be alone." Jack felt a lump form in his throat. It wasn't something he often allowed himself to feel, but the sentiment was something he hadn't expected. "I appreciate that, Tom. I really do. But I'm not alone. Not anymore." Richards chuckled softly, a knowing sound. "I know. Just wanted to make sure you knew you've got people who care. People who remember what you did." Jack nodded, his gaze drifting toward the window again. "Thanks, Tom. That means a lot." As the conversation ended, Jack set the phone down and stood up, walking to the window. He looked out over the city, the quiet peace settling around him once again. The world had changed, and so had he. But the one thing that had remained constant was his sense of duty. It had carried him through the hardest of times, and it would continue to guide him for as long as he lived. Jack Miller was no longer the young man he once was, but he was still the man who had done what needed to be done. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Jack Miller stood on the balcony of his apartment, the cool evening breeze brushing against his face. It had been weeks since the meeting at the base, and yet, the memory of it still lingered in his mind. He had never expected to be thrust back into the spotlight, to be recognized for the sacrifices he had made so long ago. But now, things were different. He was different. He had spent his whole life serving, never once thinking about the recognition or the glory. His actions, his choices, had always been guided by a simple rule: do what needed to be done. And now, as he stood here, in the quiet of his apartment, Jack realized that he had finally done his part. The world had moved on, but he had been a small part of something much larger. The phone buzzed on the table, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello," he said, his voice calm. "Mr. Miller?" A familiar voice came through the receiver. "This is Lieutenant Hayes." Jack's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't heard from her since that day at the base. "Lieutenant Hayes," he replied, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "It's been a while." "It has," she said, her voice sounding softer than before. "I just wanted to thank you again for everything. For what you did, for what you've done. We all needed to hear your story, and I think you've made a difference." Jack paused for a moment, his eyes drifting to the horizon. "I never needed to be heard," he said quietly. "But sometimes, when the time comes, it's nice to know that those who matter understand." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "We understand, sir," she said finally. "And we won't forget." Jack could hear the sincerity in her voice, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. "Thank you, Lieutenant," he said softly. "I appreciate that." As they ended the call, Jack placed the phone back on the table and stood there for a moment, looking out at the city below. The streets were quieter now, the lights flickering in the distance like a sea of stars. It felt like the world had slowed down, and for the first time in years, Jack felt like he could breathe. He wasn't the young man he had once been, and the world wasn't the same either. But there was something comforting about the quiet, something that told him it was okay to let go. He had done his part, and now it was time to move on. Time to let the next generation carry the weight, just as he had once done. Jack turned away from the balcony and walked back inside, the soft hum of the city still lingering in the background. He knew his journey wasn't over, but for now, he could rest. He had given everything he had to give, and that, in the end, was all that mattered. As the days passed, Jack Miller's life settled back into its familiar rhythm. He spent his mornings at the diner, his afternoons walking through the city, and his evenings at home, where the quiet felt like an old friend. The recognition he had received at the base still lingered, but it no longer consumed his thoughts. He had done his part, and now, it was time for the world to move on. Yet, every now and then, his mind would drift back to those days on the front lines, to the moments when everything was simpler, when survival was all that mattered. But those memories, while vivid, didn't weigh him down anymore. He had learned to let them be, to let them rest in the past where they belonged. One afternoon, as Jack sat at his usual spot in the diner, he noticed a familiar face walking through the door. Lieutenant Hayes. She was no longer in uniform, but the quiet strength she carried with her was still the same. She spotted him immediately and walked over, a warm smile on her face. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, her voice steady but with a hint of curiosity. Jack nodded, gesturing to the empty seat across from him. "Of course, Lieutenant," he replied, his voice calm. She sat down, her eyes meeting his as she took a deep breath, as if gathering her thoughts. "I know it's been a while," she began, "but I wanted to check in. See how you're doing." Jack gave her a small smile. "I'm doing fine," he said. "You know, the quiet life." Lieutenant Hayes laughed softly, the sound genuine and easy. "I figured that's how you'd be. But I also know that sometimes, even the quiet life can get a little overwhelming." Jack leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. "You're right about that. But I've had time to think, time to process. I'm at peace with it all." She looked at him, her gaze soft but intense. "I'm glad to hear that. You know, I've been thinking about that day at the base. About everything you said." Jack raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What about it?" "I think I finally understand," she said, her voice quiet. "You were never looking for the recognition. You were just doing what needed to be done. And that's something I think we all forget sometimes. That the real heroes don't ask for the applause, they just do what's right." Jack looked out the window for a moment, his mind drifting back to the many faces he had seen in battle, the men and women who had depended on him. "It's easy to forget," he said, his voice soft. "But when you're out there, when it's life or death, you don't think about the recognition. You just think about the people you're fighting for." Lieutenant Hayes nodded slowly, her eyes thoughtful. I get it now. You weren't trying to teach us anything. You were just showing us what true courage looks like. Jack smiled, the weight of the conversation settling comfortably in his chest. Courage isn't about the big moments, he said. It's about doing the right thing when no one's watching. They sat there for a few moments, the quiet between them peaceful, almost content. I'll never forget that day, Lieutenant Hayes said finally, breaking the silence. And I promise you, we won't let your story be forgotten. Not by us. Jack looked at her, his eyes warm. You don't have to promise me that, he said gently. Just make sure you remember what matters. That's enough for me. With a final nod, Lieutenant Hayes stood up, giving Jack a small, respectful salute. Take care, Jack. I'll see you around. Jack watched her leave, the door closing softly behind her. He sat there for a long time, the quiet of the diner settling around him like an old coat. He had never wanted the spotlight, never needed the applause. But in that moment, he realized that the people who mattered, the ones who truly understood, were all that he had ever needed. And that, in itself, was more than enough. Weeks had passed since Lieutenant Hayes had come by, and Jack Miller had returned to his quiet routine. The city, as always, moved on with its hurried pace, unaware of the impact one man could have on the lives around him. Jack's mornings were spent at the diner, sipping his coffee and watching the world go by, his mind often drifting back to the men he had fought alongside. His afternoons were filled with walks through the park, where the sounds of children playing and birds chirping were a soothing reminder that life, despite its ups and downs, continued to move forward. As the days turned to weeks, Jack found a strange peace in this simplicity. He had always been someone who thrived in chaos, in the heat of the moment, where every decision could mean life or death. But now, in the stillness of retirement, he learned to appreciate the quiet moments, the ones that allowed him to reflect, to remember, and to let go. One day, as Jack sat in his usual booth at the diner, the door opened, and a familiar face stepped inside. It was Colonel Richards, his old friend and former commanding officer. Richards had always been a presence in Jack's life, someone who had seen him at his best and his worst. Jack stood up to greet him, a small smile playing on his lips. Tom, Jack said, extending his hand. It's good to see you. Richards returned the smile, shaking Jack's hand firmly. You look well, Jack, he said, taking a seat across from him. I see the quiet life suits you. Jack chuckled softly. It's not so bad. A little different, but I'm adjusting. Richards leaned forward slightly, his tone shifting to something more serious. I wanted to check in with you, Jack. I've been thinking a lot about what happened at the base. About everything you said. I think you've made an impact on more people than you realize. Jack shook his head, his expression soft. I didn't do anything special, Tom. I just did my job. Same as I've always done. Richards studied him for a moment, then nodded. I know you don't like to make a big deal out of it, but you've been a mentor to a lot of people, Jack. You've shown them what it means to be a true leader. Not through words, but through actions. That's what counts. Jack leaned back in his chair, taking a moment to let the words sink in. I never wanted to be a mentor, he said quietly. I just wanted to do what needed to be done and help the people around me. That's always been enough for me. Richard smiled warmly. And that's what makes you who you are, Jack. You lead without trying. You inspire without even knowing it. Jack felt a warmth spread through him at the words. It wasn't often that he received praise, and even less often that it came from someone who truly understood him. Richards was right. Jack had never sought recognition, but that didn't mean he hadn't made a difference. The thought lingered with him as they continued their conversation, the two men catching up on old times, sharing stories of the past. As the sun began to set, casting a soft orange glow over the diner, Jack realized something he hadn't fully understood before. It wasn't the recognition that mattered, it was the connection. The people he had met, the lives he had touched, the bonds he had formed. That was the true reward. The years may have passed, but the impact of his service, his choices, his quiet strength, those things would always remain. They would live on in the memories of those who had seen him for who he truly was. And as Jack looked across the table at Richards, he knew that, in his own way, he had done something that would outlast him. That was enough. Jack Miller stood at the edge of the park, watching the leaves fall from the trees. The crisp autumn air filled his lungs, the scent of earth and the fading warmth of the sun creating a quiet moment of reflection. It had been months since his last conversation with Colonel Richards, but the peace he had found still lingered in him. He had learned to embrace the simplicity of the life he had now, but there were moments like this one, standing alone in the park, when the weight of his past would sneak up on him. Voice interrupted his reverie. "You know, you really ought to smile more often," it said with a warm, teasing tone. Jack turned to see Lieutenant Hayes walking toward him, her familiar smile lighting up her face. He smiled in return, a small but genuine gesture. "I'm not much for smiling," he replied with a chuckle, his voice a little rough from disuse. "But I'll try." Hayes reached him and stopped, looking up at the trees. "It's beautiful here, isn't it?" she said, taking in the peaceful scene around them. "It is," Jack agreed. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, just enjoying the quiet. Hayes finally broke the silence, her voice softer now. "I've been thinking about everything you said," she said, her tone more reflective than before. Jack raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. "You were right," she said, "about doing what needs to be done, no matter what. I think I was so focused on the big picture that I forgot about the small moments. The ones that make the difference." Jack nodded slowly, his gaze drifting back to the park. "It's easy to forget," he said, "especially when you're caught up in the rush of everything. But those moments, the ones that feel small to everyone else, they're the ones that stay with you." Hayes studied him for a moment, her eyes thoughtful. "I'll remember that," she said quietly. Jack met her gaze, his eyes steady. "You don't have to remember what I said," he said, his voice warm but firm. "Just make sure you remember what matters."